Yeah, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We've got Hannah Thorpe, who's our own Director of Growth Strategy at Found, talking about what even is SEO now, some new ranking factors. And then Jono Alderson, who's as a strategist who's worked with some of the world's biggest brands on pretty much everything digital, and he'll be talking about Gone in a second. So yeah, I'll kick off and hand over to Hannah Thorpe.
Thanks, Tom. Cool, there we go. I'm hoping everyone can see the screen and everything's working okay, but feel free to pipe up in the chat if something breaks, because I'm technically inept. Right, so what I wanted to do is talk to you today a little bit about how SEO is changing and kind of what the new ranking factors really are, and what that means in today's world when we're all doing SEO all the time. So we just have a couple of people joining and then we will kick off. There we go. Cool, so what I wanted to do is start by talking about the very basics, which is the algorithm that we optimize for. You'll find any good SEO will talk constantly about algorithms and blame them for pretty much everything if they don't know what's going on. And an algorithm is effectively just the math that computers are using to decide stuff and make choices, in Google's case, about what should rank. And as SEOs, we'll frequently talk about one algorithm, or we refer to it as the algorithm. And we talk constantly about the fact that we are optimizing for it, and effectively that it's this single thing we're trying to solve. But I think my view is that this is probably a little bit too simplistic. And that's because if an algorithm was truly singular, we'd be able to reverse engineer it, surely. We'd be able to work out how all of the pieces interact and actually devise some form of mathematical answer, some form of systematic approach where we go, cool, if we do X plus Y, we're going to get to here. And at the moment, we can't do that. So either none of us are smart enough to work out the algorithm, or there's something bigger at play. And fairly recently, I think it was around January time, Google actually gave this quote. And they said that there's a collection of tiny algorithms that are working in unison. And you could think of that as maybe like a baby algorithm and start to think about how they interact. And as cute as baby algorithms sound, this is confusing as hell. Like, realistically, what is a baby algorithm and how is it different to optimize for lots of millions of baby algorithms versus one big algorithm? So I kind of started trying to write down a list of all of the algorithms that there could be. And what I started to do was think about, well, we know that there's an algorithm that's called query deserves freshness. And that's when someone is searching for something and Google just decides to rank the most important, the newest piece of content. But that doesn't always apply because sometimes older content that has more historic authority will seem to rank higher. So query deserves freshness isn't always triggered on a search. And the same with locality. If I'm trying to order a pizza, I care about someone who's near enough to deliver it to me. If I'm trying to buy maybe some IT services, I don't really care where they're based as long as they can deliver the service. So when you start to think about all of this combined, what you actually realize is that these baby algorithms are all specific to query types. And whether that baby algorithm fires or not, and whether it has an impact or not, will really be determined by what the query is and what's best for the user. And just thinking of a list, I think I came up with about 15 different miniature algorithms there could be, but Google are talking millions. And if they're talking millions and we don't know how they interact with one another, we really can't ever work backwards. So the kind of easiest thing to do is just optimize all of the things. Make everything perfect and you'll rank and everything will be great. But that's a hell of a lot of hard work. In fact, borderline impossible, because if a ranking If you were trying to rank for all the things, you'd have to have the freshest content all the time, but also have the most historical authority, and those are opposites. So you can't do that. You have to start prioritizing and have to start understanding the best ways to like categorize your SEO approach. So what I wanted to really focus in on today and talk you through is something that Found considered to be the new pillars of SEO. So I've been in SEO about 8 years now, as I'm clearly getting on. And with being in SEO for that long, like when I first started, the pillars were like, you must do technical, you must do content, and you must do some link building. Over time that developed to you must do technical, you must do content, and you must do digital PR, but with the same outcome of get some links. And I think that whilst all of those elements are still actually really important to SEO, they probably aren't the way we should be thinking of it. And thinking of SEO in such a linear way is going to cause us to miss out on loads of baby algorithms and miss out on loads of opportunities to rank. So what does SEO actually look like 2020 and beyond? For me, the 3 core pillars we need to really care about are visibility, experience, and entity. So when we're talking about visibility, I really mean making sure you're seen in the market against your competitors. These are your basics, just actually being there. And then experience, where we're getting an exceptional landing page, an exceptional experience for the person visiting the site against what that user searched. And then entity, which is probably the hardest one to understand. And that's about not just having links, but having loads and loads of relevancy and authority and loads of trust signals so that everyone really understands like that you deserve to rank and you're the authority on that source. Cool. So what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about visibility, but we mean visibility clearly. We're going to talk about visibility and talk about that as the starting point. We're going to talk about growing that through into experience and making sure that the users on your site have the best time. Then for those that want to talk advanced, we'll cover off entity recognition and how you can nail that. And then talk about how to stay ahead, because this stuff is probably only as relevant as to the end of the talk before Google launches another update. And we have to kind of go back to the drawing board on more SEO things to learn. So I'll give you some tips about how at Found we like to stay ahead. So when it comes to talking about visibility, what we're really talking about is nailing down your site and your crawl index. To me, like this is something I thought I'd have stopped talking about after I first started in SEO. I was like, well, it's the basics. But so many websites are littered with crawl errors or broken pages, but also like the way you direct your crawler is all over the shop. So you're not being efficient with where you're pointing Google to. And you're also giving it conflicting signals. I think it's really important to think about the way Googlebot behaves as like a petulant teenager. It's likely to have a bit of a strop at you. And if it has a strop at you, what you're going to find is that it doesn't come back to the site as often to view your content. So then the impact of all your future SEO is reduced. So the best thing you can do is just clean it up to have a technically perfect site. And that means having things like really clean internal linking structures, making sure you're pointing to the really important bits of your site. Make it easy for Google to see everything you have on the site. So here, like you can see, this is a crawl of just someone we've been talking to recently. And you can see the green bit is the primary pages, the stuff that works. But about 75% of that site, we're pushing the crawler to stuff that it doesn't really care about and it's not adding a business value. It's better to have a smaller site, but super efficient, where it can see everything you really care about, than have tons and tons of content that really like isn't going to be adding a value. And then what you want to do as well is just nail that site architecture down between relevant pages. So Googlebot crawls at random and your site won't remain visible unless it can actually see all of your content. And if Google's crawling at random off your page, that means you need to have as many chances of it hitting the right links as possible. So if you've got 10 links on the page, every time it visits, it might only go through 1 or 2 of them to the next piece of content to index that. Instead, what you want to do is make sure that it can go to any of those pages by having them all internally linked to one another and having loads of reference points for showing how your content links and points to one another, which means that your linking map should look something like this image here, so that it's really structured around your central hub of your homepage and builds out with relevancy. And you should map that against your competitors, because what you'll find is that quite often if you're trying to rank a category or a service page against a competitor's homepage or against a really high level page in a competitor that sits near that inner circle, you'll really struggle if you don't have the same amount of internal references, because you're not pushing Google to the site and to that page as much as you are. So moving into experience, which is really the bit where you can kind of win. So all of the technical visibility stuff, it's almost like a black and white box. Like you need to tick that and nail the technical basics and have all that information. But then you can really stand out from competitors by just nailing down what you're going to do in terms of experience. And I think the first thing here to do is to map your user intent. And that's understanding what the user wanted when they made that search and what they're looking for. And then understanding that you can meet that need. So famously, there's examples of like human resources companies that tried to rank for the phrase talent management. And talent management has two meanings. So to like a normal person, you would probably think of like Simon Cowell managing like wannabe singers. Jono's face says no, but that's what you think. You think it's like a special talent and they're looking after them. Fine. But then to actually like a HR professional, there was a bit of a phase where they decided to all call themselves talent managers. So you had all these HR companies trying to optimize for this term for talent manager. Well, meanwhile, you also had all these musicians and like public speakers and politician bosses trying to optimize for that term. And even those sites from HR might have had really great basic technical SEO, they weren't ranking. And they weren't ranking because Google had already decided the intent for that query was managing those specialist skilled people. And so you're not going to be able to win against like fighting Google's intent. So if Google's decided a keyword means something, like that's life. So you need to learn to look what's already in the SERP and then optimize accordingly. The same as if you're trying to push informational content to rank and you're trying to push like something that's really useful, but everyone else is trying to sell, you won't rank. And vice versa, if you're trying to sell something whilst every other site that ranks is giving advice, you need to give advice. You need to provide what the user was actually looking for, because search engines are really there to help users rather than to help businesses. And to do that, like one of the key ways I would say to improve your experience is to think about measuring time well spent and whether you've really fulfilled the user's need. So even though it can't be a ranking factor because Google can't measure the feedback you get on forms like this, what it is a measure of actually how good your page was. And a measure of how good your page was is going to be far more impactful for understanding if you met the intent. So you can see here an example of actually Google's own content where they do it really well. They have 2 points where you can feed back. And the reason for that is because they want to know if the user was satisfied. So was this helpful, yes or no? But they also want to know if there's any more feedback, like more written, more useful feedback. And they're only really going to get that if they annoyed people. Like if the user didn't get what they wanted, then they're likely to bother to send more feedback. And that's really important for you to consider when you're putting together your pages, to give people the option to give you that feedback so that you collect more and more information. And just understand if you think your customers walked away from your website satisfied, and if you think they walked away with a need to go to another website. What you want to do is fulfill the user's issue in the quickest, most efficient way possible, so that they feel they actually had a good time on your site and they got everything they needed from it. The other part of experience is obviously site speed, which is massively important, but Jono is going to give you some really practical tips for how to look at your site speed next, so we won't waste time going into it. So the third kind of pillar to really focus on if you're thinking about newer ranking factors and what's next is to think about your entity recognition. So for those of you that haven't heard of entities before, you're definitely not alone because they're a pretty new thing in SEO. But an entity is really when something can be translated into every single language and people understand what you meant. It's when something is universally associated with it. So I like to think about entities and remember them as like those brands that become the thing. So like a Hoover is actually a vacuum, but the brand Hoover was so big and so dominant in the market that it managed to take over that space and become basically what the product was called. And there's loads of them kind of out in the world today that we deal with. And it's because they've done so well to make their products synonymous with a name and synonymous with the brand name. So what you want to do if you're looking at entity recognition is just make sure that Google can truly understand you. The easiest way to do that is to start with structured data. And structured data, like whether that's schema or, well, basically use schema because it's the easiest, simplest way of doing it. But however you're going to add your schema, it's all about just adding signposts for robots. So if you remember when you were taught to write at school, you were probably taught to signpost every paragraph and be like, firstly, I'm going to talk about this. Moving on. Secondly, in conclusion. Like that was how you would tell the teacher that you were writing with a plan. And that's effectively what search engines want you to do. Google wants you to signpost everything because then it's easier for it to process it. And if you can help speed up that efficiency of processing, it's going to benefit you by giving you higher rankings, more exciting things. So as a minimum, there's a thing called organization schema that pretty much every brand website should have. And that's a way of saying to Google, like, yes, this is my website, but please see also my Twitter profile, my LinkedIn profile, my Instagram. Like it's a way of linking all of your own profiles and saying they're the same as your website and that you're one unit. In particular, if you have stores, you should be using same as schema to like reference your GMB profiles because it will help Google kind of understand your one thing. That's super important when like on social, you might not have the exact same brand name as you have on your website because you didn't get the profiles. It's also really important if like you're a larger business and you have multiple profiles and like say you have like a specific like customer service Twitter profile, but you also have a main brand profile and then you have a campaign profile. You can just help tie it all together so that Google understands you're one and the same and all of that stuff is genuine. And the reason that's important is because then technically when someone searches for your brand name, they should see your website followed by all the information about you before a competitor or anyone else can even get near your brand SERP. And that's super, super good for making sure you get all those click-throughs. Schema will also help you get rich results like this, like the people also ask, the list answers, all of that extra insight that you might want. And then move into like your map optimization. So if you do have stores, or even if you don't, but you just want to be visible in certain areas, just make sure you're really consistent. And this comes through listing sites as well as submitting your listing directly into Google. It also comes through having a consistent Yelp, having a consistent like TripAdvisor, just making sure you're always very clear and making sure that like you don't mess around with the advice you're giving to the search engines here. So for example, Found's old address was like Found Studios, 1 Lindsay Street, and then London. Whereas quite often we'd just call ourselves like Found on 1 Lindsay Street. And by missing out the line of the address Found Studios, to a user that makes no difference. Like to a user, they could definitely get there themselves and Google it and find the location. But to a search engine, those differences is saying, even though this thing should be a fact, there appears to be a grey area. And Google and search engines just do not handle grey areas well. So you just need to be as clear as possible and as consistent as possible. And then the final kind of bit of entity recognition is probably the hardest one to do yourself, but that is really about understanding natural language processing. So you can use Google's NLP API, which is just a lot of acronyms, to understand entities. And so here, like, we've run a few sites within the digital marketing space through the NLP processor and understood how they're seen. And you can see that some of these sites, bearing in mind they all do SEO and PPC services, some of them have entities such as Google appearing more frequently than their SEO entities and more frequently than like their web design entity. Whereas like some of them have data appearing more often. And on a very basic level, what the tool does is look for the amount of times that word occurs and in relation to other words, and then gives you a scoring. But obviously a little bit more complicated than that. But this is important because it helps you understand how your website is perceived by robots and what topics it thinks you're talking about. And when you start to understand that, you realize that you need to consider every single word that you're putting on the website and making sure it's all super relevant and all makes sense to what you're really trying to say to people. So that's a lot for you to go away and implement and think about, but it's really important as well that you think about how you stay on top of things. So I just wanted to give you a couple of ways that we do. So the first is to understand that Google has to patent all of this technology. So every single baby algorithm exists as a patent somewhere on the internet, even if they haven't explicitly described what that is. So Google have helpfully created Google Patents, which is a search engine specifically for all patents. You can assign it that you only want to look at the ones Google has filed. And then you can see in your country what Google has been looking at recently. And you can see here that like Google published, and this one is from 2010 and it's on state dependent query response. And that one was literally explaining like in understanding what page should rank, like that's half the algorithm there in a patent for you to go and read. And it's a lot, like they're really difficult to read and they're deliberately written that way because they don't want SEOs going in and understanding them and then reverse engineering an algorithm and making all the money ever. So if you don't want to read those things, what I would say is read a site called SEO by the Sea that takes those patents and puts them into English that you can understand. And it will explain to you, like, Google has so many different ones out and it will explain what that could mean. It can't tell you whether they do or don't use it because it has more patents than it does use. But it will give you an indication whether it thinks that those things are being used, what that could mean, how you could apply that, how you could think about that. And you'll typically see Google filing patents for things that then come into play, maybe like 2 to 3 years before they even hit the algorithm. So it was filing things related to mobile handling and kind of the different like display versus mobile versus tablet displays and that ranking section. I think it was 2008 they started filing elements of that. So they were planning ahead for where it was going to get to now. And if you can plan your structure for your website ahead to where you want to get to now, you're going to find that you are never hit by a negative algorithm update, which is super important. And then just think user first. Like if you're ever just not sure and you're ever like, should we do that? Shouldn't we do that? Put yourself in the user's shoes, because ultimately what Google is doing is optimizing for users and trying to make sure that everything that it does is the very best experience for a user. So on that premise, what you need to do is make sure your site does the same. If you have the best answer and the best product and the best solution for someone, you have to kind of suspend your disbelief in Google and believe that your site will rank because of that. And the same with every piece of content you write. If you answer the question in the best way and you've nailed those visibility basics, you should be almost entitled to rank and be able to perform better. And that is a wrap.
Cool. Thanks very much, Hannah. That was really insightful. And I think you covered so much ground in a short space of time. So yeah, I just wanted to, oh, and thanks for your feedback as well, Ken. If you've got any more questions, or if anyone's got any questions, now's a good time to ask, and Hannah can give you answers on any particular section of our talk. I had one. Firstly, I thought the bits around the technical basics, I really agree with that, and I've got an SEO background as well, and I think that's a big factor for a lot of brands. I was wondering, Hannah, how, if you could go into a bit more depth around how people can start to look at their competitors and assess what content they're using to target terms, and then how you can like bring that into your own strategy.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the first one would be, I see so many like websites where they don't crawl their competitors' sites. Like if you're crawling your own site to see your own site health, you should also be crawling your competitors. Like check what they've done, because you'll be able to see if they've invested in SEO just based on like how technically sound their site is. You'll know if they've got good SEO work going on. But then when it comes to understanding like what competitors have targeted, as a basic, like start in a tool like SEMrush and start inputting the keywords you really care about and pulling out who the top 10 sites are that are ranking. And then you'll start to see the same sites appearing again and again. So that way you're making sure they're true search competitors rather than like business competitors who don't care about the same keywords. It's a small difference, but it's really important that you are competing in search rather than competing just in life. And from that, see what keyword they're targeting and then almost deconstruct the pages they have ranking. Understand where it sits in that site hierarchy. Look at the number of words they've used on the page. Look at what they've marked up as a heading. Look at how they've tagged their imagery up and kind of dissect it. And then do that for the whole of the top 10 and see what they have in common and see which one like scales. And as you see which one like scales down, you'll see like, okay, cool. So the first thing that ranked, actually the page was at the root, it was their homepage that ranked and it had 3,000 words on it. And then you might see that position 5 had 2,000 words and was 2 levels deep on the site. And you can go, cool, I can see there's a clear correlation here and I should start to factor that into my planning. I just saw a question come up, which was about like meaning whether when you crawl, whether it's technical or you can read through the site. I think there's like 2 forms. So manually look at the site, like start by manually going and having a look at what they've done. We had a client a few years ago that was insistent about that their competitor hadn't changed anything on the site. And they were insistent because the rankings had remained the same. And so they were like, therefore they can't have changed anything on their site. But actually what they'd done was just massively improve the user experience. So they were getting all the conversions, but probably the same amount of traffic because of the same amount of rankings as before. So whilst they hadn't actively invested in SEO, they'd fixed the experience up so well that it was detracting from our client. And I think it's really important to like see the bigger picture and look at the website as well as like using the technical tools like SEMrush, Screaming Frog, Deep Crawl, Content King. Like there's so many that do it. So just find one that you like the interface of.
Cool. Thanks very much for answering those questions, Hannah. If no one's got any other questions for the moment, but yeah, so what we'll do is we'll move on to Jono's talk about site speed, which is an ever increasing importance in the digital space. Over to you, Jono.
Cool. Thank you very much. Let's see if I can work out how to share my screen. This is always a challenge. Here we go. How's that? Are we good? Yes.
You're good.
Cool.
Yeah.
That will do. Cool. All right. So, hi, I'm Jono. I'm from a company called Yoast, which if you have ever been anywhere near WordPress are hopefully familiar with. We're best known for our SEO plugin for WordPress, something like 11 million sites running our kit, which is pretty cool. My job is mostly focused around our research and development. So I'm a bit of a technical SEO, a bit of a developer, a bit of a strategist, and I take all of that and work out what are we building, how does it work, where are we going. A big part of that is understanding where the web as a whole is going and where companies like Google and Twitter are taking and shaping the web, and a big part of that, as the guys rightly point out, is in site speed. So I'm going to give you circa 20 minutes of about 5 hours worth of speed content compressed down, which will be enough to get you started and tell you where to start, and then hopefully you can take some stuff away and do some stuff on your own. Okay, so why is this important? Because above and beyond SEO and rankings and the obvious importance of getting people to your site, users expect your stuff to be fast. This is research from as far back as 2016, when a bunch of Google research suggested that delays of over 3 seconds on a website could lead to over 50% abandonment. That's really, really scary when you consider that if your site is already that slow, your analytics tags probably aren't firing until 4 or 5 seconds in. You're probably losing audience that you didn't even know you had. You might already be losing over half of your traffic and you don't even know it because those users don't stay around for long enough for you to record them. And this isn't just about people arriving. This is almost half of people expect a site, like consciously expect a site to load in less than 2 seconds. This is from as far back as 2014 from research by Wired magazine, in a world where the web was slower, when mobile phones were less sophisticated, when 4G wasn't a thing. Even back then, in a slower world, people got irritated when your site took more than 2 seconds to load. And this isn't because they're sat there consciously grumbling about every millisecond that goes by, but of all those milliseconds which pass, every single one means that a user is more likely to get distracted or think about going and getting a coffee or tabbing back to Facebook. And all of those actions and distractions add up and mean that you lose conversions. Over 20% of users will abandon their cart, even if they've already committed to buying something. If they feel like the transaction process is going too slowly, they will add to the cart and hit buy and then give up because your site is slow. This stuff is important. Time is money. People are impatient, and delays reduce the likelihood of them spending or converting or taking any kind of positive action. Even if they don't realize that, even if they don't articulate it or complain about you to it, those milliseconds are costing you money. All of Google's research and all of the stuff that they're focusing on at the moment, of the 2 large areas that Google are investing in and focusing, one is schema and structured data, which Hannah touched on, and the other is speed. It's not quite yet explicitly a ranking factor, or if it is, it's only in certain context scenarios, but users prefer fast sites. And the users that prefer fast sites are more likely to visit them, are less likely to bounce, are more likely to link and recommend. All of these things tangentially impact rankings. Speed underpins user experience. You cannot have and deliver a good user experience on a slow site. These things are opposites. And we all know that user experience in aggregate, whatever that means, is the biggest single ranking factor. Maybe that's synonymous with brand, and maybe links still matter, but all of these things are tied in. The overall user experience that you deliver to people when they visit your website determines how likely you are to rank highly. You cannot deliver a good user experience if your site is slow. And for Google, of course, it's worth considering that one of the reasons they're so invested in this space is that for them, speed is the same thing as efficiency. Every large image they have to download, every slow page that they wait to load costs them time and money and electricity. Google's biggest outlay in terms of money going out the door each month, apart from people, is the electricity they use to crawl and process the web. A faster web is better for Google, and therefore they are incentivizing all of us to be faster. So that's the premise. What do you guys need to do? The first thing you need to do is cancel the big web development project that you're currently planning. Chances are a bunch of you are sat there saying, I know my website is slow. We have a big project somewhere in the pipeline for later in the year, and our developers are working on it. Sure, it's already a little bit late, and sure, it's already a little bit over budget, but when it's done, it will be fine. This is empirically not how you approach site speed. Unless your site is well and truly monstrous. And there are some cases where things are built so fundamentally badly that they're impossible to retrofit, but that's rarer than you'd think. Often the issue isn't the platform or how it's used or how it's built. It's a people problem and a process problem. The way you approach speed and the way you make your website faster is through 1,000 tiny tweaks, now and every day, forever, until you die. You need to develop a culture of speed. You need to have processes in place which make sure that your day-to-day processes around content publishing and adding features and changing technologies don't add overheads to your site. You need to have agreed thresholds and budgets for performance so that when new features add business value, but do so at a performance cost, that's a conscious and deliberate trade-off. You need every job function in your business to be aware of and a stakeholder in the performance of your site. Otherwise, you will always be getting slower and fighting to keep up. And remember that even if you are making your site faster, and even if you're on top of it, you've probably got competitors who are going faster still. Your site is going to feel comparatively slower in a world of 5G and platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Gmail getting faster and faster in comparison. It's not enough to be treading water. You have to be really on top of this. The way that we do this isn't rocket science. It's that we go and find the slow things and make them faster. Who knew? But what does that mean, and where do you start in particular? Well, there are two things that you need to understand about site speed and how to go about it. The first is that there is no such thing as speed. Answer this question. How do you measure the speed of your site? What does that mean? You could say, for example, I could skip some slides. Well, you could say, for example, what if the server responds really quickly, so all the hardware and the technical stuff is on point, but then the content takes ages to display? You remember in the late 90s when images would take ages to appear and the screen moves around? There are many sites that still feel that way. The back end can be super fast, but the front end can be super slow. How fast is that site? What is its speed score? What about the other way around? The server takes ages to respond, but then everything appears instantly. Is that faster? It's not quite the same thing. To measure and understand speed and then to go on to improve it, we need better definitions to understand what we're talking about. For a long time, this has been difficult. There have been many different tools, most of which have been nonsense. As of the last month or so, Google's launch of their Web Vitals metrics, which are available in Google's Lighthouse tool and Google's PageSpeed Insights tool, which I've linked to, are the only way you should be measuring your site speed. Yes, there are many other tools where you can plug in a URL and get a nice, comfy, simplified score. These are the only metrics which you should be looking at. First content, I'm going to have to look at my other screen to read the tiny font. First content for Paint is how long does it take to get something to appear on the screen? First input delay is how long until I can click this and it responds as if it's done and finished loading. Largest content for Paint, how long until the most important thing on the page is loaded, whether that's a big banner or a headline. And cumulative layout shift. As it loads, does everything chunk and move around, which is the most irritating thing in the world when I try to click on a button and a bit of the page loads and it pushes it out of the way. These are the metrics that you need to be optimizing for, and Google's documentation around how to understand and optimize for these is phenomenally good. And it starts right from the very, very basics and moves right through to the extremely technical side. If you want to compete on speed and to survive in the coming years as Google places more and more emphasis on this, you have to level up your understanding of these definitions and these metrics. This is the singular truth when it comes to site speed. You have to use these metrics, and these are the only thing that matters. Google are considering these metrics to be of the same level and category of importance as, is this site safe to browse? Is this site a spam trap? This lone image from their developer blog really paints a picture of just how critical Google perceives speed to be. This isn't something you can tinker along with in the background. This is as business critical as having a safe website. Here's a really great example I pulled from a tool yesterday. I'm going to have to make this bigger so that I can see my own example. We're looking at a site which doesn't score particularly well. Now, there's a lot going on here, and a lot of it is very technical, but you don't have to be phenomenally technical to understand it and to start to reverse engineer it. You can see where there are problems. It talks about specific types of errors and issues and gives you timings and says, there are problems here. If we pull one out, I don't know what's happened to my slide there, there we go. It's taking almost 3 seconds to manage key requests, which we should be preloading. And you can click on this and open it out, and you get some really good insight. You get, we're loading fonts, and it's taking almost 3 seconds. We should do something about that. And there's links to documentation that you can click through and follow and get more insight on how to do this. This isn't rocket science. This signposts all of the problems and the possible solutions. There's another one at the bottom which really stands out. I thought this one was really interesting. Avoid enormous network payloads. That sounds concerning and fairly obvious thing to fix. If you want your site to be fast, don't try and send your users 3.5 megabytes of stuff. So what is that? Let's click into it, and we can see very quickly a lot of this is video. We're loading circa 2.5 megabytes of video on that initial page load. And on a 3G phone, or even a decent wired connection or wireless connection in an office, that's going to take a second or two to come across. Now, there are techniques we can use. We can click on these links and follow the documentation to say, how do I lazy load that so it only appears when the user scrolls down to it? Or how do I reduce the size of the video file itself? Or the actual executional change side of this stuff is well documented and pretty straightforward. I appreciate that got very techie very quickly. Let's take a step back, because the other thing that we need to remember is the second law, which is that the only thing which matters is the user's perception of your speed. Now, perceived speed is hard to quantify. It's something that a user is perceiving, and it's therefore hard to measure as an external thing. But if a user feels like a site is fast or slow, that's much more important than whether the metrics say it empirically is or isn't. And there are lots of moving parts that we need to look at when we start to say, how do we make things feel faster? This next image is particularly terrifying. This is from the Web3 consortium who define internet standards. And it's a breakdown of all of the things which happen when you load a page. Right from what happens when you start loading that page, to connecting to the server, to connections under the sea kicking in, and the page and the request. All of this stuff has variables which, if you make them faster or slower, might make those pages feel faster or slower to the user. This is indeed terrifying and complex. The good news is that tackling all of this is no longer an art. For a long time, this has been magic and voodoo and tweaks and clever hacks, much like SEO used to be. The good news is that performance as an industry is now much more mature and defined. Fixing all of this is a science, and it's well documented. Every site in the world can load in under 1 second, and that might require retrofitting unperformant components. It might require making some compromises on how and when and where things load. But there is no website offering any functionality or with any degree of complexity or uniqueness that cannot load in under 1 second. And if you're told otherwise, people are lying. To achieve that, you just need to follow the rules. So what are they? This is Google's really handy, slightly simpler, albeit still quite complex, breakdown. And there's links to all of this throughout of what happens when you load a page. And there are 4 components. The first of which you can't do anything about, because DNS lookup stuff is limited by the speed of light and cables under the Atlantic Ocean. But the HTTP request and response is where your hosting and your servers and your content delivery networks live. The response time is where your content management system and your plugins and your themes live. And your client-side rendering is all your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This is all stuff that you own and control, and you can shrink these timescales when there are problems and bottlenecks. The challenge is that it's easy for me to give out generic guidelines and advice and say, just make it faster, but everybody's site is different and has different bottlenecks and problems. If only there was some kind of guide you could follow for resolving this and understanding where to start. Well, handily there is, and no surprise, it's written and maintained by Google. This is a screenshot of their Web Fundamentals documentation. And it's written by some of the smartest people in the speed and performance space who are literally writing the book on how to do all of this. And as I mentioned, it starts right from the very, very basics of how should you think about this and understand it, right through to here's a complex technical example about dialing into a server in something that looks like the Matrix to change stuff. You can start at the beginning, work through, use it as a reference. As you dig through this, you can see just how deep it is. There are hundreds and hundreds of pages and topics here in these expanding sidebars that cover every single topic and factor and facet of performance optimization, some of which came up in the examples I showed just now. We want to eliminate unnecessary downloads. Well, here's the guide. We want to lazy load some resources. Well, here's a link to an enormous another set of guides about lazy loading. All of these are solved problems. You can use Google's Lighthouse tool that I linked to earlier and their page speed insights to identify what the problems are and then reference the documentation to solve this. None of this is ambiguous. None of this is complex or confusing. If you know what the problems are you're trying to solve and can find the right solution. So where do you start? You go and you find the slow stuff. Fairly obvious, but you use the tools to find problems. And this is where some of the other tools which aren't great for metrics come in place. So some of you will no doubt have seen tools like this. This is from Web Page Test. It's one of the very popular ones. And one of the things it does is it generates a waterfall diagram of your site loading. This is for Yoast.com, and it's a little bit out of date, but you'll get the idea. You can see all of the things which the page loads, in what order and what's dependent on what, and all the colors of different stages of that loading happening. If we get rid of this side a bit, because that's all our analytics tracking that fires conveniently after the page is loaded, you see the blue line is where everything's finished. We've tailored our analytics integration to say only load all of this after everything else is done. That took 2 clicks in Google Tag Manager for reference. This bit's really interesting. We can see we're loading a whole bunch of JPEGs, but there's a kind of bottleneck. You see one of the first two are fairly fast, but then the second two of the four start much later. That means that everything that happens afterwards is delayed. This isn't ideal. So let's use a tool. This is Pingdom's web page test tool. It's the same kind of thing, but we can order this in different ways. We can start to say which are the slowest pieces of things on our site. You don't have to be massively technical. All I've done is click order this by load time. This is interesting. This is a tiny piece of JavaScript on our site. I don't know what it does. I don't know what it's for. I have no idea. But I know that a 4 kilobyte file shouldn't take half a second to load. That's problematic. And when you start looking at other things, you can see what's happening is this file is stopping other files from loading. This is a bottleneck in our page loading. I don't need to understand any of this to understand that bottlenecks are bad and we ought to resolve them. So I say we refactored that file. I sat down with the developer and said, please fix this. It took him about a day. And our site now loads in almost half a second. Not because we did any crazy complex refactoring of databases and backends, but because we removed a bottleneck in that cascade. It took me half an hour to spot that issue, to find the right piece of documentation, and to bully a dev into fixing it. This is straightforward stuff. It's pretty cool. The thing I'm trying to get across is for everybody will have different solutions and different problems, and there is no magic bullet that you can use to solve all of them. You need to find those 1,000 tweaks for yourselves. So very quickly, what can you do today? Where can you start? This is actually a cut from a much longer presentation of about 180 slides, which goes into great depth on all of the things you can do and all the different stuff, covering things like managing and removing custom fonts, about using lazy loading, which I've touched on, around things like how you should, which bits of JavaScript you should be using. I know that all of this sounds pretty terrifying, but it's all pretty straightforward stuff that you can find the right documentation for. There's some interesting stuff about what type of hosting and vendors you should be using potentially, depending on the size and throughput of your site. There's some interesting newish toys like Scroosh.app you can see in the corner there, which is Google's very own image optimization tool. It's phenomenally good. And then in the bottom right, my favorite tool of all, Google's Chrome Developer Console Network tab, which you can open just by right-clicking on a page and going to Network, and you can see all of the things that Google's seeing in terms of the way a page is loading. Again, this is far too much to take in this time frame, but go have a look at my longer deck, and in particular, go have a look at Google's documentation. If all of this is scary, you can just cheat. And there's one very particular way to cheat, which is to go and use AMP. Which is potentially politically contentious depending on how involved you are in the SEO space. This, if you're not familiar, is a framework for developing and building websites, which was initially created and launched by Google, but since has a much more active involvement from people like Firefox, Mozilla, Cloudflare, Amazon, some other players. It's designed to be a way of building websites, which makes it impossible to make slow websites. There are constraints and restrictions on things like how much custom JavaScript you can use, when you're allowed to use pop-ups and intrusive messaging, how analytics works, those sorts of things. It avoids all of the traps which your developers might be falling into just because they don't know better, because they can bake the constraints into the very platform itself. If you're at the point where you're considering a re-platforming, this might be a technology that's worth evaluating and probably one that your developers haven't come across. This is the future of the web as far as Google are concerned, or at least they're trying very hard to fight to make it so. It's at the very least worth looking at. If you're on WordPress, you can field test this by using Google's official AMP plugin. This is made and maintained by people from Google and others. I've contributed to it. It's pretty cool. And you can at one click convert your site into AMP format. Some stuff will break, including complex layouts, but it's fixable if you've got a bit of dev resource. And then suddenly your site will never be slow again. And not only that, it will get faster over time as Google launches new features. It's a very interesting way of circumventing the problem. Not for everyone, but worth acknowledging it exists. TLDR, this stuff is worth focusing on because it makes a difference. The changes we made at Yoast radically impacted our conversion rate, our visibility, our rankings, our bounce rate, our time on page, any other metric you care to mention, because people subconsciously get distracted and dislike waiting. If you can get your interactions to feel as close to instant as possible, then you keep people in that flow, and it's one less reason for them to get frustrated and abandon. This stuff is a no-brainer. All of this work, we are now at under 400 milliseconds on Yoast.com. And we're a pretty complex website with internationalization and a WooCommerce shopping cart that is pretty slow in the back end. But all we've done is look for bottlenecks and look for bloat and remove them one at a time. Every day I spend 20 minutes looking for the slowest thing that's loading. And I find a way that we can shave 2 kilobytes off an image, or move a piece of JavaScript before a piece of CSS, or remove a thing that we're not particularly using or loading. This isn't a magic bullet. This is a death by 1,000 cuts. This is how you go out and win like a rainbow unicorn king. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Feel free to Q&A me or grab me on Twitter or ask me more questions about this. Hopefully that was a useful starting point.
That was very useful. Thanks very much, Jono. That was really good.
Awesome.
And I had a question, but you kind of answered it off at the end there, almost. But I wanted to know if you would condense this 5 hour that went to 20 minutes into kind of a one-liner to convince a stakeholder who doesn't know anything about digital to focus on site speed. What would you say to them?
The frustration costs money. And in fact, one of the slides I cut out because Google deprecated the tool, which is annoying, they had a really nice calculator where you say, what is your conversion rate? How much traffic do you get? And how many milliseconds does your site take to load? And if you said, if I shave 500 milliseconds off, it would turn that into okay, that's $500,000, which was so handy. I might rebuild that because that's the best way to answer that question. It's such an invisible cost. And especially when it means that things like your analytics isn't running properly, so you're not even aware of how much money you're losing. Turning that back into a dollar sign is pretty powerful.
Definitely. I think there's a few questions in the chat actually. So cool. I think we've got one from Imogen there. So when it comes to prioritizing speed improvements, which improvements take the least amount of effort for the best gains on average? For example, we know that we need to be looking at things from what's going to make the most impact, but if resource is limited, where should we start?
So 2 flavors, I guess. One is it will be different for everybody, and you should definitely go look at the tools and find the new tools are really good at measuring where those biggest bottlenecks are, and you should always remove the bottlenecks. That said, almost always there are easy wins in things like image size and format. People upload 2 megabyte PNGs when it should be a JPEG, which has a different encoding method and therefore different sizes depending on the scenario. And rarely should a JPEG need to be bigger than, say, 100 kilobytes. So that first pass will quite often throw up things that are pretty obviously bloated. And the biggest bang you'll get for your buck is just reducing those initial bloat.
Great. One from Hannah. So if you do have a site where it's wait until a big web dev project is there to fix it, would you recommend using things like separate web stories or AMP?
Oh, that's interesting. So I really like AMP. It was very politically contentious in the SEO space initially because of how heavily Google were involved in it and some of the constraints that were involved, like your content would be served from Google's domain, which has questions of ceding of ownership and politics, etc. A lot of that is now fixed. I think AMP is a really great tool if you're thinking about rebuilding your site because it's designed to get things right. It's still not perfect. There are still some limitations and constraints. Many businesses don't like it because it won't let them advertise, show loads of pop-ups to their users. And that's a bad user experience, but many of these businesses rely on it. So you definitely need to make sure it's the right format. Web stories is an interesting thing to flag. This is Google developing something which on the surface looks very similar to Instagram, but it's powered by AMP. So it's a different content format that's much more about swipeable images and text. It's going to be huge. Google are investing loads in it. There's a beta plugin for it in WordPress at the moment that I've been working with the team on. That could be really game changing. Imagine an open source competitor to Instagram that becomes the de facto format for that kind of swipeable image content on the web and not Instagram. It's pretty cool.
Can I ask another question out loud based on that to follow up?
Yeah.
If you were doing that, do you think it's a crap experience to have a really fast web story or AMP if your site's really slow? Like we've got some clients who've got slow sites and we can't do anything right now to fix it. And we think about doing those as like subdomains and little added extras to add in a WordPress subdomain because they're not on WordPress and use AMP through that. Would you say it's worse to be good and then crap? Or consistently bad? Interesting.
So I guess there's 2 parts to that answer. One is that Google really weight the initial impression. Like the thing that they really care about is when a user comes from Google to a specific web page is that fast. And then everything that happens afterwards is obviously still important to the business and the user, but Google is less interested. And depending on your technical approach, you can definitely make trade-offs on do I make the initial experience faster versus later stuff slower, especially around things like caching. So I think Google are already accidentally conditioning for a web where those subsequent experiences are slower. I think given that choice, I would definitely have some of it be fast rather than all of it be slow. And if there's a bad user experience later in that journey, that's a good argument for budget and tech to fix that. More broadly, I think that if your business is having to put WordPress on a subdomain in order to make bits of it fast, you have a much, much larger problem, much higher up the train, and ought to be asking very difficult questions.
Great, and I think we've got a few minutes left and probably time for a couple more questions. There's one there from Imogen around, if you've got a headless website, what's the best tool to use to get accurate readings on page speed on the new vitals in bulk?
That's really interesting. So a headless website is where, so a conventional website, you type in a URL and the server responds and spits a page back, and that loads in your browser. A headless site, your initial request just returns a framework, and then everything else is handled by your browser and the client. It's all JavaScript based. You're not going back and forth to the servers. You navigate between pages. That really changes the way that the site speed tools measure your site. In some cases, it might make it look a lot faster. In some cases, it might make it look a lot slower. If you've built a headless site right, i.e. it's using server-side rendering, it's using some form of pre-caching, and Google sees the same thing for the client-rendered version versus the server-rendered version, it shouldn't be an issue. If you've not quite built it right, the difference in the metrics is probably a result of that. But it's an interesting question as more and more the web is going to become headless. It's something we just launched support for in Yoast, which is pretty cool. All our SEO stuff is now available headlessly. But yeah, you will need a degree more context when you're measuring the speed of things which are headless, because it's working differently. Sorry, there's no easy answer to that. Is that look at it and think about it and take it with a grain of salt, and maybe look at Chrome's network tab rather than third-party tools.
All right, excellent, thank you. And I think that's everyone's questions. So yeah, thank you very much to both of our speakers, and thanks to everyone else for joining. We've got a link that might be coming up in the chat or might be sent round, where you can sign up for our next talk. And I think if no one else has any questions, that's everything. So thanks all very much.
Thank you. Awesome.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.